Thank you for joining us after lunch with my fellow panelists. And special shout out, loving the diversity on this panel. I'm a very strong advocate for women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I think it's important to get a range of voices onto important panels like this and to be able to share our thoughts and hear our views and your views on how we could, make tomorrow better than it is today. And of course, quite interesting that I'm using a paper tip on this panel on digital humanitarianism. It's okay, I have my iPad with me too. So this is a very important panel, and it's very close to my heart. I'm Lynette Tan, I'm from Space Faculty. I started working with a lot of satellite and space-based technologies from about 18 years ago. And recently, or rather, I've moved into a lot of robotics and AI, cybersecurity, deep tech, and to create learning pathways for young people and old people, professionals from all ages, to learn more about deep tech. And that's why I find this panel important, because there's a lot technology can do for us. There's a lot that technology has changed in the world we operate. And certainly in an important field, such as in providing humanitarian aid and being prepared against the climate crisis, that's a very, very big role that technology can play. But it's not such an easy walk in the park, for sure. There are good and bad. And today we zoom into digital humanitarianism. We won't cover all aspects of deep tech. And we will explore how we can harness technology development in crisis response and management. At the same time, being mindful of the contemporary risk associated with deep tech tools, deep tech capabilities, and issues in a digital age. I'm very happy here to have distinguished panelists with me. And let me know when I need to stop for the video to be flashed. And we have here, physically with me here, Professor Fleur Johns from the Faculty of Law and Justice from UNSW Sydney, Australia. We have Ms. Pauline Pale, Senior Analyst from RAND Europe. And we have Mr. Ahmed El Sayed, Regional Head of UN Global Pulse, Asia Pacific. And lastly, Professor Andre Zviter, Chair of the Governance and Innovation and co-founder of the Inter- and Transdisciplinary Branch, Faculty Campus at Friesland, University of Groningen in Netherlands. Thank you. Let me know about the video, okay? Sorry. So following this, I have some questions, but I would like to really encourage all of you to use the Pigeonhole later for the questions. I think that really is the part about learning where you're contributing and identifying questions that maybe we don't think about in our job, and someone else in this audience would also benefit from the questions you're asking. And we will have a Mandeep video message now.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to join the RSIS, RHCC Humanitarian Futures Forum and share some thoughts. My name is Amandeep Gill. I'm the UN Secretary General's Technology Envoy, and I'm dialing in today from New York. I would have loved to be with you in person. Please accept my apologies, and I wish you the very, very best for your consultation. I've been asked to speak to the interface between digital technologies and humanitarian action, some of the drivers, some of the priorities that organizations, stakeholders active in the humanitarian space should keep in mind. And I want to begin by sharing with you a historic development that took place, that happened in New York, September 22nd, at the Summit of the Future. Member states, 193 member states, came together to adopt a pact for the future, and as part of the pact, a global digital compact, which is a comprehensive framework for global governance of digital technologies and artificial intelligence. 20 years after the World Summit on Information Society, the Global Digital Compact charts a roadmap for digital cooperation to harness the immense potential of these technologies and close digital divides, while mitigating their risks and their harms. A key aspect of the Global Digital Compact is the commitment of governments to uphold international law and human rights online and to take concrete steps to make the digital space safe and secure. And in doing so, the compact recognizes the critical contributions of the private sector, technical communities, researchers, and civil society to digital cooperation. So it calls on all stakeholders to engage in realizing this open, safe, and secure digital future for all. The drivers that we should be aware of in the humanitarian space are not very different from the drivers that are bringing about digital transformations in other parts of international action. Governments everywhere are harnessing digital technologies to close the last mile gap, to leapfrog some of their development challenges, and to build the economies of the future. Data is being leveraged in this manner, and recently we've seen how digital public infrastructures can be used to bring about greater financial inclusion and provide a more inclusive innovation space for companies big and small to build the future digital economy. Artificial intelligence is the latest emerging digital technology. It allows us, as we've seen with the Nobel Prizes for physics and chemistry this year, to move from siloed approaches to problem solving to these systems type of approaches. And therefore, the humanitarian space cannot be immune to this society-wide global transformation being brought about by digital technologies. So, what are the priority areas that humanitarian agencies, actors should keep in mind? The very first one is, how do they leverage digital technologies in a situation where resources are more and more hard to find, where you need to make every dollar count, and where you also need to engage partners that can make some resources available in non-traditional ways, whether you call it crowdsourcing or in-kind contributions. So going beyond the usual suspects in terms of raising resources, or also in terms of leveraging capacities around the humanitarian space. Related to this is the aspect of narrative setting. Humanitarian action is taking place today in very contested political spaces. And therefore, humanitarian agencies, while keeping in mind their neutrality, while keeping in mind that they need to carve up this apolitical space around them, which permits that action to take place in safety and in a sustainable manner, they need to also join in setting the narrative around humanitarian action. And there again, digital technologies offer a lot of opportunities through social media and other manners of reaching directly not only to beneficiaries, but those who facilitate humanitarian action. The second area that should be priority for humanitarian agencies is inclusion and safety. Digital technologies are a double-edged sword. We can use them to bring about more inclusion, such as DPIs for financial inclusion, but at the same time, there's a risk of exclusion. If you have populations that are suffering from the digital divide, they don't have meaningful connectivity, or the connectivity and the content is not available in languages, in cultural contexts that they understand, then you are actually risking exclusion. At the same time, safety is important. Humanitarian action is essentially about vulnerable populations. They may be vulnerable to exploitation by non-state actors or pressure from governments and other actors that are leading to the humanitarian situation in the first place. So as humanitarian agencies work with them, they have to ensure that the data of the beneficiaries and other aspects of their lives, their conditions, are handled responsibly and safely. And finally, I want to underline the importance of cybersecurity for humanitarian agencies themselves. We've seen recently how cyber attacks have compromised humanitarian action for major humanitarian agencies and international organizations. So therefore, all of us in the international space need to think about cybersecurity more seriously, need to have this cybersecurity culture come from the very top, and need to invest in cybersecurity capabilities. In conclusion, I like to say that overall, there is a lot to be benefited from. Data and artificial intelligence tools can help us if they are well governed, if they are well developed as per the context, as per the needs. They can open up more possibilities for humanitarian action to proceed with limited resources in contested political spaces and with a wider array of partners than has been the case before. But to get there, we need to get the governance of these technologies right. We need to get the human resource, the human capabilities within our own organization and with our partners in place. Skills, training, capacity development assume importance in this context. A rich agenda for the future, and please join us in taking forward the Global Digital Compact. I wish you the very best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amandeep Singh Gill, for being here with us through the video message. I think he touched on quite a few points relating to the digital age, AI, cybersecurity, certainly data. I want to start the next question to Fleur, next to me, on her book that she published called #Help. Very trendy, very modern. It sheds light on the digitization of humanitarianism and its implication for global order. I thought it might be nice if you could share examples of how digital interfaces are reshaping the world we address crises and emergencies.
Thanks, Lynette, and thanks to everyone at the RSIS and RHCC for putting this event together. It's a great pleasure to be here talking about this topic with my colleagues here. So I do want to give a range of examples, as you've asked, Lynette, but I also want to focus on one specific example, which is an early warning tool aimed at food insecurity called Hunger Map Live. And then I want to talk about a little bit about some of the impacts that myself and my collaborators have been looking at, with a particular focus on the kinds of impacts associated with making humanitarian conditions and disaster situations informational, making them into problems for which technology is the answer. Because these tools don't just provide decision makers, potentially, with more timely, more granular information, and they do that, which is very valuable, but they also have potential to actually transform the way we understand and approach humanitarian situations and disaster situations. And that's an aspect of their effect that I think needs to be kept in mind. But in terms of examples, as you know, every major international humanitarian organisation has an innovation arm these days concerned with exploring and promoting and advancing the potential for digital technology, data science, machine learning, AI, to optimise those organisations' work. As we heard from Dr. Gill, many governments are also pursuing these kinds of initiatives, and every major tech player in the commercial sector is heavily invested in the humanitarian field as well. So there are many, many examples, but let me give you a flavour for some recurring themes. Early warning, as I'm going to talk about one example, Hunger Map Live. Early warning is tools are being very widely developed. Many of those combine multiple data streams, often public and private data streams, which is interesting and exciting in many instances. Humanitarian mapping is another area of focus for a lot of work in this domain, concerned with trying to flesh out areas of maps that have not been well validated or are not detailed or not highly differentiated at the lowest level, so to aid humanitarian decision makers in response. And Humanitarian OpenStreetMap is one example. A lot of those initiatives around humanitarian mapping employ crowdsourcing or sort of citizen science type dimensions using public actors, the public more broadly, to participate in validating the mapping data. And Humanitarian OpenStreetMap is one example, as I mentioned. There's been lots of deployment of blockchain technologies in both delivering aid, but also in tracking and trying to verify humanitarian value chains and supply chains. There's been, for a couple of decades, quite extensive use of iris scanning in registering humanitarian complainants, including asylum seekers and refugees, and disambiguating them, so that's another area of work. There's also lots of work on using machine learning to analyse remote sensing data, satellite image data, and other forms of remote sensing data to try and gain more granular insights or more timely insights into areas of humanitarian need and also the immediate aftermath of disaster. And also there's some interest in using wearables. UNICEF has a wearables for good challenge that they're trying to stimulate the idea that wearables could be useful in the humanitarian sector. And in terms of the granular insights, to give a concrete example, the Asian Development Bank has worked with in Malaysia and Thailand in looking at training models that to analyse, validated against various sort of ground truth data, to analyse nighttime illumination on satellite images, so nighttime lights, as a proxy for understanding poverty at the provincial level, so or the sub-national level, so down to a 4 kilometre by 4 kilometre. So that's an illustration of the aspiration and the hope that these tools might enable a better understanding of the distribution of need and relative need. I said I'd mention Hunger Map Live specifically. That's an online, it's a website that you can access, anyone publicly access, which was developed out of a partnership between the World Food Programme and the Alibaba Foundation, started in 2018. And it provides a map of, and on which 90 countries' food insecurity situation is represented, visualised using a classic dashboard scheme of, traffic light scheme of red, yellow and green. Some of those countries visualised, their food insecurity situation is represented using mobile phone survey data generated using automated survey through mobile phones. But other countries where it's not possible for a range of reasons to do that kind of surveying are represented using a machine learning model that was trained on 14 years of data from about 68 countries that takes publicly available inputs, economic inputs, foliage, measurement inputs, and weather and other data, and then predicts, which is not, in this context, doesn't mean forecasting, it means more like estimation, estimates the food insecurity situation in a country for which survey data is not available, with the idea that that improves decision makers' access to information, and the data is represented at the first sub-national level, so provincial level. And the aspiration is to generate near real-time insights, although the underlying data varies in terms of the frequency of its updating. So this is the range of tools that we're talking about when we're talking about, and there are others, of course. But let me highlight in terms of some of the implications that we've been looking at, my team and I, three kind of dimensions of what I was talking about the implications of making a disaster situation or a humanitarian situation informational. And one is that this potentially has potential to de-link our understanding of that condition from other ways of understanding humanitarian need, and de-link it spatially and temporally. Now, it doesn't have to be the case, and tools like Hunger Map Live are intended to always just complement other decision-making tools and analytical tools, so it doesn't have to be the case. But the risk, I think, is that we become so concerned with illuminating the present that in some sense the representation, the visualization of a disaster situation or a humanitarian need almost has no future and no past. That it tends potentially to get de-linked from other ways of understanding humanitarian need, questions of equity, questions of trade and investment relationship, questions of land use regulation, tax policy, all the knowledge that we have about the underlying factors that inform the highly uneven landscape of humanitarian need. But as I said, that's not something that has to be the case, but there is a risk there of this kind of de-linking as we acquire tools that enable us to have a much richer picture of the here and now. The second and related impact is the potential to reshape relationships around disaster response and humanitarian need. Relationships with the public, when we put tools out there like this, like Hunger Map Live, they're publicly available, we signal to the public a new sort of sense of what effective response, what kind of effective response they might expect, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's also the potential to transform relationships with the private sector. In a lot of these instances, the backroom, the sort of underlying infrastructure, data centres, undersea cables and so forth, is to a significant degree held in private hands. So the critical infrastructure is bound up in a set of contractual relationships, proprietary relationships, which make it hard to ensure that they serve the humanitarian purposes. So that's something that I think all the key decision makers and people working in this space are highly attuned to. The challenge of partnership and collaboration, which can be very important and beneficial, ensuring that the public interest remains served as we enter into those partnership relationships, given that it involves regulating really in a contractual mode. And contract law is not really well disposed to safeguard third-party interests or public interests. Contract law is obviously not oriented towards that primarily. So that's a second way, one way in which relationships. There's also a sense in which the humanitarian endeavour, the relationship between those participating on the donor side, broadly understood, and intended beneficiaries is transformed. Their relationship is transformed. At one level, it becomes possible to do humanitarian work at a great distance. So when you're validating map data as a member of the public or a volunteer, you can do that from your home. You can do that from anywhere. So the prospect, and using remote sensing tools, of getting involved in humanitarian action from a great distance transforms the way we navigate the relationship. On the other hand, when you're talking about wearables, it's the most intimate, so it's the most proximate. It's literally worn on the body. So again, that transforms the relationships, this transformation of the relationship between the parties concerned. And third and finally, just to wrap up, as I mentioned earlier, there's a potential to transform what we understand good governance or effective response to mean in this context. So increasingly, it means eliciting continuous data gathering, data management, data wrangling, as it were, and processing, and involving the public in that, involving intended beneficiaries in continually reporting on their conditions and their needs. And that presents a challenge of the sort, raising the sorts of issues that Dr. Gill has already highlighted. So I look forward to our discussion.
Yeah. No, I think that was a very good overview about when we talk about the digital age, what is possible is the surge of data, right? So it can be good, but that also inundates sometimes potentially decision making. But I guess it's up to us to share the knowledge and to create expertise to make it work. And which brings to my next point, Pauline, who works on RAND and Foresight Initiative. So I love RAND's mission, providing, is a non-profit organization, research organization, providing solutions to influence public policy, which is important, to make the world safer, secure, healthier, and more prosperous. So very, very grand mission here. And so in the Foresight Initiative on the use of emerging technologies, linking to Fleur's point as well, what are the potential opportunities and risks? So we see possibilities, but we also see problems. So how do you see that impacting humanitarian practice?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lynette, and thank you so much for having me. So I think before I kind of delve into the risks and opportunities that emerging technologies can bring to the sector, I think it would be beneficial to explain a little bit what the Foresight Initiative has been and what we're trying to do. Because I think, as it was mentioned this morning, the humanitarian sector is largely a reactive sector to disasters and events. And what Foresight aims to do is not to kind of predict the future, but help stakeholders across the board to think about the factors that are likely to influence the future. And that's kind of a different mindset than the one we usually tend to adopt in terms of thinking of the future. So what we tried to do in the initiative was not only to understand the current trends and in terms of use and adoption of emerging technologies in the sector. A bit of a disclaimer that my specific project focused on emerging technologies, but AI was or is being investigated in a dedicated specific project. So we did consider some technologies that are enabled by AI, but the AI dimension was not really something we looked at in depth. And so therefore, there are different activities than the sector itself, the humanitarian sector, but also partners such as militaries and governments can take to support this kind of change of mindset, both in terms of like thinking about how emerging technologies are going to be used to support humanitarian response, but also how can these tools help humanitarian organizations themselves in their day-to-day operations. Because I think the dual dimension is not just using tech for beneficiaries and affected communities, but those emerging technologies can also very much support the work that humanitarian organizations are doing, including internally. So in terms of like the kind of thinking about the future, and I'm going to touch upon lots of points that Fleur has mentioned and that others I've mentioned this morning as well, is that it's very important to consider both sides of the coins when it comes to emerging technologies, and making sure that the range of possible solutions to humanitarian problems is considered. And is technology one of them? And should that be the case, then how do you kind of investigate the possibilities of adopting technologies in a certain setting? I think what we've seen is that there is a lot of work that is being conducted at the moment, but moving from pilot projects in a specific context and scaling up the use of emerging technologies is something that seems a bit challenging for the sector across the board. So maybe developing some sort of like guidelines or guidance on how to use technologies or how to think about using technologies is something that the sector can also consider. And we've developed some sort of like roadmap in the course of our project to kind of develop some key steps, including a range of questions that, again, will depend on the specific technology you're looking to explore. But also think about if you're looking to implement this either in your own organization or for affected communities, is there some sort of guidance that these stakeholders would need? Is it kind of a paper-based document, which I understand we've now moved on from? Or is it kind of a MOOC or some sort of like digital education tool that could help them understand both the kind of purpose for which we're using the tool, because I think something that we haven't really touched upon yet is informed consent, and I think this is really key to humanitarian action, including when we talk about emerging technologies. So is it kind of those types of things? And should you want to kind of then develop specific technologies in specific contexts, what are the steps you need to take to make sure that the tool that you're looking to use is going to be relevant for the communities that are affected, but also is it going to help foster the humanitarian action that you aim to implement in the first place? So I think in terms of like technologies that seem to be really promising and that there has been a little bit of back and forth, including in front of some of the risks that they present, iris scanning and more largely biometrics is a really good example. Because I think initially this sector was quite enthusiastic about this emerging technology, and it's been kind of tested in different contexts. And we've seen during our project that some humanitarian organizations, because of the kind of malpractice or missteps that have been taken along the way, have decided to step away from the conversation. So for example, I believe Oxfam at some point decided to withdraw from all biometrics related activities. But the challenge in that is that you're not able to shape the conversation. And you're not able to take part in the development of the technology in the sector. And therefore, they decided a few years later to adopt a memorandum of understanding so that they could then come back into the conversation to make sure that there are risks, but those risks need to be taken into account when you're looking to develop the technology.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. You know, again, it is a process, right? It is not the be-all and end-all, and there's no panacea to solve everything today. But if I could move on to Ahmed's point on, and I think we have discussion later as well, on the Global Pulses project. Global Pulse, I understand, is the Secretary General's Innovation Lab. Sounds like a fun place to work.
It's a very good name.
Right. And DISHA, right, the Data Insights for Humanitarian Action, to provide long-term access to diverse data sets. So I don't know, irises, eyeball scans, if they are part of it. But I thought it might be good to hear from you on exactly the point that Pauline did raise. How do you protect these data sets and protect them against vulnerabilities? And at the same time, not let people lose heart that it's not working and it comes with so many other problems. But to keep going to improve things so that we can ultimately land at a better place.
Thank you very much. First, allow me to just explain what does the UN Secretary General Innovation Lab mean. Such a big name. So we work at the intersection of innovation and human sciences. Global Pulse is a network with offices across regions. I'm heading the regional hub for the Asia Pacific, based out of Jakarta, Indonesia. It's such a privilege to be here and also to listen to distinguished speakers that spoke before me, because they touched on quite a few interesting points that relate a lot to DISHA and the work of UN Global Pulse. So Global Pulse is not new to the region. We've been here for over 12 years with over 24 projects across the region, mainly in Indonesia, but also in parts of the Pacific, in the humanitarian sector as well, trying to utilize data and prototyping and piloting promising solutions over the past 12 years, where mobile phone data and other anonymized data sets can be utilized to help expedite the humanitarian response. One issue that we've come across often in the region and in other parts of the world is the sustainability and the scaling part of those pilots. So we define scaling as both sustainability and replicability. From that perspective, we've also managed to narrow down on a few methodologies. Some of them are actually learnings coming from humanitarian innovations. And we have developed a standardized method, and DISHA, the Data Insights for Social and Humanitarian Action initiative, is also looking at those methods. So how are we developing solutions that are responding to need, informed by the local contexts, problem-based, that actually are based on sustainable data pipelines that can actually go to scale through either integration into existing systems or being part of bigger coordination mechanisms that can take those on the long run. DISHA, as an initiative, is a public and also private sector partnership. So we have partners like Google with us in DISHA, and through Google AI, we have managed to recently launch a solution in New York during the Summit of the Future in September, where we have managed to automate the post-damage assessment in given contexts using high-resolution satellite imagery. And that solution has already proven to increase the coverage of the post-damage assessment coverage by 7-folds and decrease the time for actually conducting those assessments by 6 times. Analysts are still needed to verify. However, this solution shortens the time that is needed for countries to actually assess post-damage that happens through earthquakes or other natural disasters, and be able to respond better with a more targeted response. So there are, I would say, solutions there, and the good thing about some of those solutions that we're trying now to develop is that it can easily go to scale to any context because it relies on a data pipeline that has good coverage. Now, that being said, I really would like to also connect to a point that was mentioned earlier relating to how we are utilizing AI and data solutions. And it's very important to mention here that first, these are not disconnected, or this conversation is not disconnected from the conversations earlier this morning. So these conversations can help maybe expedite some of the response happening on the ground, enable colleagues at the front line doing all the hard work, but these are not replacing any of that in practice. So this is one important point. And the second one is that these tools also require the right policy environment. They require the right legal framework to be able to function. They require also the skills and the capacity. Excuse me. The skills and the capacities, which are not really easy to find now outside the private sector. So bringing skills and capacities to run data solutions in this space and trying to compete with private sector for those skills and capacities is sometimes challenging. So there are many methods, and I really also enjoyed how Amandeep touched on the great momentum that we live in right now, where countries are really seeing how important AI can potentially be, what are the significant uses, and I think looking at existing use cases, but also understanding how can we look at those and take those to scale is very, very important. I really also would like to encourage more of the strategic foresight work. It's one of the capabilities that we have also, and we've been working with at Global Pulse, because we do believe that the future does not necessarily need to be a linear projection of the present or the past, and there are alternate futures that we can assess and then plan together to hopefully move towards the most favored future. So these are just a few points I wanted to touch on, and I will be happy to learn more also from everyone today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ahmed. That was really good. And you spoke about the partnership with the private sector, so Google, which also then, something I hope Andrea can help us to address in how can humanitarian organizations and private companies evolve? Right, so we hear that with private companies, there's the advantage of attracting talent and being familiar with scaling and having a constant data pipeline, which humanitarian organizations might not have access to. But how do we do that so that we can maintain respect for the humanitarian principles and don't let that get exploited?
Well, first of all, allow me to thank the organizers for putting together such an inspiring panel. And we had so many beautiful examples by Fleur and by Pauline and by you, what can be done with this data, and it is really inspiring. At the same time, I'm here a little bit as a devil's advocate for data minimization. We do not need more data, we need better data. So we are always under the impression that the more data we have, the better we get insight. What we tend to forget is, like with the fog of war, the fog of data can just as much cause problems. And it causes problems in manifold ways. And allow me to illustrate it with a concrete example. Remember in 2014 in West Africa, Ebola broke out, and amongst others, WHO and MSF were really doing heroic efforts in dealing with that crisis. One part of dealing with an infectious disease is collecting blood samples and sending them for analysis. So a lot of blood samples were collected, they were sent to the US for analysis, and then upon inquiry, one of my colleagues asked, well, please, private lab, now delete this data. And they said, no. Why? It's our data. So that touches on the first point, right? We don't have a proper concept of data ownership. Data ownership up until now is a contractual obligation. So how you contractually regulate data ownership is how it can be dealt with. At the same time, people were never asked for their consent of whether this data could be used for gene sequencing and for further studies. On the other hand, we have, of course, another complaint. The complaint that data was not readily available for those studies, for public health studies and so forth. And the complaint that hospitals refused to provide data for contact tracing. Now, we live in a time where we see specifically data sharing being covered under the privilege of exceptionalism. Exceptionalism that during an emergency, surely all data should be available, accessible. And the downsides can be both for the individuals that are affected by the crisis, but also for aid workers. In 2010, another example, a group started working on crisis mapping. That was one of the first examples, PAC report, you remember. And PAC report had a really ambitious goal. They wanted to crowdsource local information, put it on a publicly accessible website for humanitarians to know where are the needs, where are the roadblocks, where are the coverages. And just shortly after it went online, the Taliban came forward and said, great, now we know where the humanitarians are, we're going to attack them. So, of course, it was immediately put behind a secure firewall, but the damage was already done. Now, last but not least, there's another important point that we hardly touch upon, and that's the humanitarian principles. I know we touch upon them all the time, but what do they mean in a data fight context? We are all familiar with the four core humanitarian principles: humanity, impartiality, independence, but we hardly discuss neutrality. And when I discuss it with my students, it's very hard for them to put the finger on what does it really mean. But neutrality states explicitly that humanitarian agencies should be neutral to the political and economic aspects. Now, when you start involving private companies, we had this example with Google and with Facebook, there is hardly a way to avoid a perception that besides the humanitarian aspirations that these organizations surely have, that there is also a second thought that they might expand their audiences. And so there I find a very problematic anchor point. So when it comes to data minimization or data protection in humanitarian action, we often speak of data responsibility. We have some very good examples of how we can deal with that. Humanitarian data exchange pioneered by OCHA was one of those examples. It sets up protocols of how to anonymize data. But the problem with anonymity in data is that we have normally the perception that anonymity is an on-off switch, right? We take out the names and then it's anonymous. But that's not how anonymity works. It's a continuum. The more anonymous, the less there is information in the data, right? So what happens, of course, in wonderful initiatives is that you start pooling data, you start linking data sets. By linking data sets, you make data less anonymous. What I haven't touched upon yet is another point, and that is group privacy. right? We tend to think of privacy as an individual affair, but specifically when you think of conflicts and you think of streams of populations that are displaced, these displacement streams can be critical points of attack for belligerents. So they become very, very sensitive information. Usually we don't think of group privacy as sensitive information, but it just goes to show that sensitivity of information is context dependent. If you are in an earthquake, you want to know, or you want to have people knowledge of your location. If you are in an armed conflict, you don't want people to know where you are, right? So I think to bring that home, one of the principles of data sharing should be no commercial interests, right? And to make sure that this is in data sharing agreements right from the start. That the rights of the affected are protected. That includes, as you say, absolutely rightly, informed consent, the right to inquire what data is being collected about me, and the right to redress that data, whether it's correct or not, and the right to be forgotten. And I think there is something else that we can learn from the European General Data Protection Regulation, and that is purpose limitation. Purpose limitation means that we can use data only for the points that it has been collected for. Why should that be any different in a crisis where information is so much more sensitive? I would argue specifically there, purpose limitation is one of the utmost priorities. And then when it comes to humanitarian innovation, I know that puts restriction on how we can use and reuse data, but there is ways around, and anonymity is not the best way. We have developed with colleagues at our statistical office in the Netherlands ways of synthetic data that replicates data in such a way that it can be useful for both training sets as well as for analysis. And I think that is where we need to look at, so that data retention policies include data deletion policies.
Thank you. Thank you. Right on the dot. Thank you, Andre. So we've got very interesting questions here at Pigeonhole, and I really encourage all of you to put in there quite sharp and incisive, some of them. So I think we're going to have a good round of discussion. I will find a more neutral one first, which is that it talks about mapping technology can look informative, as we have expounded on. But when you look at the data itself, and Andre has alluded to that, there are limitations, right, and how it could misrepresent local conditions. So a bit of a fake data, but I'm saying it very casually. What are the top tips to evaluate big data in crisis? Very tough question.
Well, if I may, I already exposed myself as the devil's advocate here. I think, see, when in 2016 we started working with humanitarian analysts, we realized the problem is not so much that they lacked data and they needed big data to do better analysis. They lacked good, high-quality information for specific needs. So we developed a whole toolkit called Humanitarian Intelligence, helped them become better analysts and how to evaluate the data. So when it comes to big data in crisis, I mean, one of the key tools that we use is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence can be very beneficial, specifically when it comes to forecasting. Those tools can be really useful. But we have always to be aware that the quality of big data is usually very low. And, data scientists will tell you garbage in, garbage out. So what you need is actually high quality data to go into those data sets to produce high quality outcomes. And so big problem with big data is it's low in what we call value density.
Yeah. Go ahead, Fleur.
Just to add, build on that, I think we're in a lot of furious agreement on this panel, but I think two things. One would be combining data. So one of the really interesting things and valuable things that Pulse Lab Jakarta has done in their social science team is bring together ethnographic insights, social science insights with technical insights developed through, acquired through machine learning, and kind of test those forms of knowledge against each other and kind of co-produce them. And I think that's a really valuable model, to not throw out one, build in the human insights and test the inferences that are being drawn through automation against those human insights. And I guess also be prepared to set it aside, have a sense of humility. I mean, a lot of the kind of guidelines that humanitarian organisations have built up around refugee registration have this theme of humility, that you won't get the numbers right. It's highly political. There'll be lots of interests at stake. It's, there's a kind of humility built into the professional consciousness of humanitarian professionals that I deal with that's really valuable. And I think we need to extend that skill set of kind of decision-making humility into this sphere, so that we don't lose that decades and decades of built-up knowledge and human insight into how to make decisions under extreme situations of dire need and kind of less than ideal information environments.
Very, very well said. Thank you. So this one has top votes. Very interesting question, hot question. So if you didn't take that first question, Pauline and Ahmed will have to take this one. So why do this is not that one, but okay, let me see if I could pop it up instead. Why are we talking about AI, quantum, etc., when there is still a significant proportion of the population in Southeast Asia who have no access to understand these types of digital tools and information? Are we getting ahead of ourselves?
Sure. Thanks. I'll try to make a start. So I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, I think it's quite important to understand the context in which you're trying to develop those tools and understand what the level of familiarity is with a specific technology. And going back to the previous question, I think that understanding can help. For example, during our study, it was mentioned that, I don't remember which organization it was, but they were looking to have some initiative, and to do that, they decided to just distribute cell phones in local communities. But it turns out that giving cell phones to teenage girls was very not well perceived at all within the community, and ended up being completely regarded as an intrusion into the local practice and cultural practice. So I think it's about also making sure that when you look to develop those tools, involve local stakeholders from the start. It's not just about the headquarters deciding that you need to implement this tool, but there's also a tension between top-down and bottom-up approaches. And it's very important to build the capacity at the local level and not just have the kind of northern world companies or organizations dictate the way the tools are going to be used in a local context. And that works for Southeast Asia, but I think it works for other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to, I actually admire this question a lot, because it is important to see that there is a digital divide. There is a digital divide in the region between countries. There is a digital divide within countries as well in the region. And I wouldn't call for introducing a high-tech, computing-heavy solution to a local context right away, where digital connectivity is not a given. Broadband internet is not a given. And then the skill sets to operate this is not a given. However, many governments at the central level do have capacity and are building capacity at speed, and are actually asking for support in figuring out how to introduce AI into the way that they work. There are many examples, even developing their own ChatGPT in-house for some ministries or for some governments, trying to train their own AI and try to build their own tools and try and integrate this in their know-how. So I think it's important to cover all levels of access, try and level the playing field as much as possible. Try and not forget that digital connectivity is still not 100% affordable at speed in everywhere, and that the skill sets need to also be built gradually, while factoring in also big issues like data security, big issues also relating to AI governance as well. Because these are all questions that many countries are currently faced with in the region. Some are way more advanced than others. However, everyone is facing it at the same time.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. This is also a good question with very high votes. So why do humanitarian organizations build their own tools, their own GPT, for example? Is this a waste of resources? Can we reuse, not reinvent the wheel? In my line of work, instead of always building a proprietary one that's very customized to the organization's use. What do you think?
If I may, I think there's a lack of awareness more generally across the sector of what is being done elsewhere by other like-minded organizations. And because of that, and the lack of access to tools that already exist, if not knowledge of them, it's then quite difficult to build upon something you're not aware of. So I think those kind of information sharing settings where the sectors can come together and share not just the way they use things, but also good practices and lessons learned from previous experience is very much something that, in the context of our project, was something humanitarian organizations we engage with were quite keen to explore.
If I may add something to this, I think there is also there is a bit of a structural issue here, which is the incentive mechanism. And I think the incentive is very vertical. So organizations still feel that they would be probably getting better access to funding if they are developing their own project, their own tool, and presenting that as their own. This is something that we see in organizations, we see even across UN agencies. So when we looked at the innovation scene within the UN a few years ago, was one of the first things that we did. And it was very interesting to hear that everyone was saying the same thing, that the incentive system is very vertical and that organizations usually are rewarded for showcasing their own project, their own solution. So this is something that we're trying to address. It's not just about the organization, it's also related to governments, it's related to development partners and the donor community and how they see this. And I think more and more now there is the sense or there is the call for more collaboration. And in the innovation workspace, because these are all new tools that should follow the innovation mindset, the first thing that you do before you start developing your own tool is do your research and look for something similar that exists that you can adapt. And that usually is a good practice that we try and amplify. We do this in our network, but I'm also seeing this and a lot of this in other parts of the UN system as well.
Great. And because I have such an esteemed panel of thought leaders, I really want to go into this question, even though it's not the one with the most vote. But I think it's good to tap onto your thoughts on how can humanitarian actors narrow and not exacerbate the digital divide.
Well, maybe to start with what has been already mentioned, and I think that this remains an important point, is the inclusion of all stakeholders in the process of implementing, developing, and then rolling out those digital tools that we like to use. So we still have a habit, and that hasn't changed since the last 20 years that I'm in this field, of providing people with aid without the idea that they are equal stakeholders in this endeavor. And the same goes with those digital tools. So when you implement, say, digital ID for resource management. Those processes are highly invasive, and for societies and for groups that are already under a lot of pressure to understand what the benefits are, but also what the risks associated with them are, and what the accountability mechanisms are when they want to seek redress or want to have data changed. That is really crucial. So you can't have informed consent without understanding what you're signing away in terms of your data. And so that sort of digital literacy, I think, is really at the foundation of avoiding the growth of a digital divide.
Yeah, just to add to that, I guess I think humanitarian organisations have a lot to add to understand, kind of generating and sharing understanding that the digital divide is not really a new divide, that it's really a divide that is really a literacy divide. It's a divide around access to electricity. It's a divide around all these kinds of well-known, well-documented inequities that we know a lot about, just get translated into this, extended into this new form. So it's not really a new thing. It's something upon which humanitarian organisations have been working for some time, which means that just throwing tech at the problem, sharing laptops, is not going to get you very far unless you also engage with the underlying inequities that are being expressed in this new form, and think about access to electricity and education and these kinds of issues. So I think humanitarian actors have a lot of insight to share to kind of preempt the sort of tech determinism that you sometimes see in the kind of, particularly among well-meaning, well-resourced commercial actors that want to kind of demonstrate their humanitarian credentials.
You know that's true, right? It's not really a new problem. It's just a face of the existing problems that we've experienced. So I hope I have time for last one. This one has very top votes. Digital threats might originate from states that regard humanitarian actions as disruptive to their political or war goals. So can humanitarian agencies and organizations mitigate the online and offline impact of these threats? So after this, it's they're on their own.
Maybe just as an example, like one of the threats that we hardly are very aware of, maybe increasingly so, but that is database poisoning. So that is like deliberate attempt to manipulate databases to skew the information into a certain direction, and that can happen particularly when the data is collected online. Can happen through various means. We've seen it in election tampering and so forth, specifically when it comes to social media campaigns. So I think there is a huge scope of cyber risks and digital threats that we have mapped out, but that are so quickly evolving. I remember we just recently published a paper on AI in cyber security and cyber threats, and it's outdated. Like after 2 years, it's outdated because things have evolved so fast. So to keep track on that, you require small humanitarian organizations that are already tight for budget to have their own cyber division, and that is sometimes really impossible.
Well, otherwise, we come to the end of this panel session, and then it goes back to everyone on the table to discuss some of the things that we've talked about and shared, and share your views with the rest of the table. And if you want to share them on Pigeonhole, please feel free to do that. Just a quick, so just to, because Alistair gave me instructions to summarize the session, and I will do so. I think there are opportunities in the digital age, and for sure it will always be that two sides of the coin. What could be possibilities to do things better and genuinely create a positive change and then create a lasting impact also comes with its own set of challenges, and there are already so many things on everyone's plate. And now we have to deal with new unknowns and things that we don't know. So I think this is big topic and big conversation. We didn't land on anything. But if I were to also just add that we should be open-minded, and one of the ethos in space faculty, which I love but my marketing does not like, is quite a mouthful, is to experiment, learn, and lead. There is a necessary process of experimentation, not to trivialize lives and not to trivialize what's going on, but it is necessary, and I think we do need to keep going. I think digitalization is inevitable. And it's as real as the existential threat we face. And we would be really remiss to not harness the capabilities of technology because it seems so big and so daunting and just say, we're just going to do what we've always done. I don't think that's the direction we all want to go. But how we get there is really through a lot of thought leadership sharing, community building, community sessions like this, and learning what's affecting the practitioners. And then leaving also people with the headspace and electricity to think about how digital tools can be used to make things better. So I want to leave this with you on the table. Do have a think about it. To be honest, I really had a good time at this panel because it's about technology. It's something I love. And I really think it can be harnessed if we put our heart and mind to it to make things better for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tan. Professor Fleur, Ms. Paul, Mr. Ahmad El Said, and Professor Zwitter. Please, may I now invite Colonel Tan up on stage to present the tokens of appreciation. Colonel Tan, please.